G'day, welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. I'm Pete Wargent from AllenWargent Property Buyers. I'm here with Chris Bates from the Alcove Mortgage Specialist. G'day, Chris. How's your week been?
Oh, I'm doing all right, Pete. Wouldn't mind being in Bali like you, to be honest. But yeah, nothing too exciting. Mother's Day just happened here, and just some friends' sort of birthdays happening this weekend. Nothing too exciting to report on. We're sort of in a lull of getting ready for the winter sort of feeling here in Sydney. What's happening with you?
Yes, I'm in Ubud this week. So, yes, namaste. And if you hear any dogs barking or monkeys in the background, that's why. Special sound effects. So, yeah, I'm just enjoying a morning juice. So, yeah, cheers. Yes. So I always find when I travel, it takes me a bit of time to sort of switch off and get onto the local pace of life. So I've only been here a couple of days. But yeah, it's good to be back. I haven't been to Bali for years, actually, probably about a dozen years since we were last here. So it's good to see all the changes. Certainly looks like tourism's coming back after the COVID shutdowns. So from what people are telling me, I think international travel is still expensive and food is expensive and hotels and everything. So I think that's having an impact, I think, on global trade and travel and tourism. But yeah, I mean, in saying that, there's a lot of people here from all over the world now, in particular from Russia, notably. So yeah, I think things are getting back to normal after a massive disruption through the pandemic.
Yeah, we're actually off to the UK to see my granddad. He's turned 91 this week, and yeah, so it's going to be interesting to see what's the feelings like in Europe. We're going to France with some good friends who's actually French in August. So it's head down, bum up for me for the next probably 3 months. But yeah, excited to see what the traveling's like and around the world. So what's happening in the world, Pete, in terms of, seems like over in the UK, how's the vibe?
Well, it's pretty topical, isn't it? Because the UK, I guess they've had some recent local elections, and the hard right sort of anti-immigration, or at least pro-Brexit party Reform, absolutely swept the board in the local election. So just in the past week or two, the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, he's put out 15 posts about immigration in 3 days. So they're suddenly saying they're going to toughen up, tighten the borders. Immigration's not working, integration's not working. So I think that's a problem all across Europe in recent years, is that they've had very big numbers on the immigration side of things, and things have not always integrated particularly well, in particular in Britain with illegal arrivals. I think this is kind of the reason I thought it was topical is I saw in the news in Australia this week, Melbourne to hit 9 million people by 2050. I mean, this, we used to talk, I remember Simon Kustenmacher and Bernard Saul saying, sometime in the next century, Sydney and Melbourne will be cities of 10 million. But it seemed like some kind of an abstract concept from a million years into the future. And I think when I first lived in Sydney, the population was about 3.5. And yet now, less than 25 years away, we're talking about Melbourne and 9 million. Obviously, from a housing market point of view, that's going to create huge and unprecedented demand. But I just wonder whether there's a bit of a warning shot from Europe. I think generally Australia's got a far better controlled system for its skilled visas and graduate visas, and generally immigration has been managed much better. I think the challenge in Europe, for example, the UK has net government debt of nearly 100% of GDP. Well, here it's about 30 and heading towards 20, hopefully, over the next decade. So maybe we don't feel quite so ripped off by taxation in Australia. And I think just generally societies have integrated much better, better controlled migration programs. But I think the warning shot is Australia would need to get it right. If we're going to go to 9 million cities, we need good integration, schools, infrastructure, road, rail, airports, health and medical facilities and so on, as well as the social cohesion. So, yeah, did you catch that article in the news this week?
Yeah, and I think, Melbourne's got some struggles at 5 million, right? I think, changing things like level crossings down there was a big job. There's a massive amount of investment into freeways and the rail down there. They've even got a train to the airport coming, you know what I mean? So I think there's a lot of things to sort out at the city the size is now, rather than what it needs to be at a city double the size, right? But Melbourne's a very big, flat place. So when they talk about Melbourne, they're talking a big, big distance, one of the biggest cities in the world, I believe, from that. So Yeah, I think that the topic all around migration and population growth is really something that is getting louder and louder every year. I feel as inequality gets worse, more and more people, the owner occupier rate decreases. I guess there's a bigger growing divide between the haves and the have nots. And the intergenerational wealth over the next 10, 20 years is only going to amplify that, I believe, and it's going to get worse. And so, does the government have to come out? I mean, you look at the Liberal parties were, part of their approach was to cut migration. Do we go to a point where we have to make, ridiculous cuts to migration? Potentially, but there's also a lot of people that come here that Australians potentially don't do, and big parts of our building sector, etc., that we need are often overseas as well. And so, I think there's always a counter argument that you can easily cut migration, but what is the impact of that, and where does it affect the most?
I think the interesting thing to me when I saw these articles, so if you look at City of Melbourne and some of the Victorian government websites, there's a couple of places where they say, come and have your say about how the city should look when it hits 9 million by 2050. But there's nowhere, it's almost like a fait accompli. There's nowhere that it says, does anyone think this is actually a good idea? It's almost like it's baked into the system now. And if you sort of think about the city of just 5.4 million, I think, for Greater Melbourne today. I mean, that's implying an extra 150,000 people every year for the next 25 years to take it up to 9 million. I mean, those are some tremendously big numbers. And I guess there were some stats out this week from the ABS, and it showed that net immigration, although it is below the record highs that we saw a couple of years ago, it's picked up again actually over the past few months. I think, I don't think Labor's making any plans to sort of slow things down. And this, of course, it comes at a time we've got 2,800 building insolvencies over the past year, a lot of challenges around rental supply. The construction sector just generally struggling to keep up regardless. And, if you throw an extra 150,000 people a year into Melbourne and maybe 100 and something in Sydney, I mean, it's just it's going to be an ongoing challenge. I saw Tim Gurner in the media this week saying, get ready for a 15-year rental crisis. I think, you could argue we've sort of been in a rental crisis for the past decade or 15 years. If you look at the rate of household formation, we've really struggled to sort of manage the inflows from the rental market point of view. It hasn't always shown up in higher rents, but it's really difficult to find a good rental in the school zones and the locations that you want. So, there's some big challenges around it. And even though we're kind of in the quieter winter months at the moment, obviously this is a structural issue that's going to be around for a long time to come.
Yeah, the rental crisis is the big one. I mean, I had some comments about that, I think, in past episodes. I think I don't even think we really understand how bad that's going to get over the next, say, 5-10 years, because from my point of view, I look at it and go, well, where have the investors been buying the last few years, and where have investors been bailing, and where are we not building, and where are we building? And, in places like, for example, Melbourne, there was always pretty low yields there. It was one of the benefits of living in Melbourne is that it was pretty easy to rent because there was a lot of apartments that they just built for investors, but those things aren't stacking up anymore. And more investors are bailing out of them, and other investments, for example, in Melbourne, things like the land tax down there. And a lot of investors are buying in regional locations, higher yields, they've only got low borrowing capacity, and also the proliferation of buyers agents, pumping that sort of strategy. And how good they are at marketing to push that strategy. So, I think that's where you're going to really see it, 5-10 years down the line. Or maybe I could have rented a house in Melbourne quite cheaply 5 years ago, but now it's actually really hard. It's no investors are buying them, and every year more and more investors are selling them. So, I think there's some unintended consequences coming down the line.
Yeah, a lot of challenges. So this is our weekly 2 cents segment on the Australian Property Podcast, where Chris and I just run through the big 3 news stories of the week as they relate to housing. Also, stick around because at the end we'll do some listener Q&A. I did a midweek Q&A this week, but we always get more questions coming in, so we'll cover off a couple of those at the end. And do send in your questions because, it's always good to tap into Chris's expertise on the lending side of things, and I try and muddle through on my side as well. So let's have a look at this first story of the week. House prices projected to rocket higher. Macro business. I guess this was a news story that was covered in various outlets. And I think it's, in a sense, it's not just one story. If you look at National Australia Bank, SQM Research, Pro Solution, they're all sort of forecasting something similar, which is housing prices going up across all 8 capital cities and regional Australia over the next couple of years. I think we know some of the reasonings behind it. Interest rate cuts, I don't think markets are pricing quite so much in terms of dovishness now as the tariff turmoil takes a bit of a pause. But I guess the structural issues we mentioned, housing shortages persisting. I think auction clearance rates last week in Melbourne suddenly jumped to above 70%. So a few bargain hunters out there. I think the interesting, one interesting aspect is coming from the election. Labour Party's got a couple of policies. So firstly, a new tax on superannuation funds with balances above 3 million. So I guess what I'm hearing is that people are starting to sell down their assets in super in anticipation of that new tax coming in. And I think 2 things will happen. Firstly, I think early inheritances. I think people will push funds out to their kids and grandkids. And secondly, I think people will just choose to put more money into their family home instead of topping up their superannuation balances going forward. And then, of course, we've got the 5% deposit scheme for first-time buyers kicking in from January 2026, which is obviously going to create a lot of demand in that sort of bottom quartile of the market. So there's a few different forecasts out there. I think when I look at the ABS figures for housing lending that were out this month, actually volumes are down a bit over the past 3 months to March because of tight lending standards and so on. But the average loan size is kicked up about 50,000 over the past year. And I think that's just because the tighter lending standards have shut out people at the bottom end of the market. And it's really favored people in households who earn $200,000 per annum or more.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about this is it's property markets are based a lot on momentum and sentiment. And when, news article after news article starts coming out, market's going to take off. And then they start getting some numbers back from, Fatalities Monthly. And all of a sudden there's this real sort of FOMO that kicks into the market. And I think, post-election, we've seen a little bit of that sort of already in a week or so start to come out. I mean, and when you think about it, the fundamentals make sense. April was a dire, compared to 5-year averages or 10-year averages, we're way down the amount of properties on the market. The first home bias changes, the 5% deposit, are huge. Basically, anyone is eligible for that if they can get their 5% deposit, and they don't need to pay stamp duty depending on the state. And so a lot of people are like, well, now this is my chance to actually get in. I've been shut out of that policy for the last few years and I've really wanted to use it. I need to take advantage of this. And if I don't take advantage of it now, I'm going to regret it if I try to do it in 2 years' time because I know prices are going to go up. You've got the big Australia sort of side from Labor as well, but the taxing unrealized gains in super, this is not a new policy. This has been thrown around for years, but this the size of the election win, it's highly likely that's going to go through. And that's a real change, in our tax policy to not taxing realized gains, but unrealized gains. And if I had a lot of money in super, I'd be like, God, you do not want me to have money in super. And maybe I should start taking money out of super, giving it to my kids, upgrading my home. That's a great tax-free store of wealth, buying investment properties in anticipation that, that might get, grandfathered if you make changes to negative gearing, or helping my kids buy investment properties. So I guess people are just looking at, well, do I leave my money in super or do I put it somewhere else? And I think that's what Labor are basically encouraging. So, yeah, I think that's how really this story for me is around the shift in sentiment, and that has a huge impact into the psyche and the momentum in property markets.
It does. I see SQM Research forecasting that housing prices could increase by between 7 and 15%. PropTrack did one of those articles that project the current rates of growth or the last 5 years and project them forward 5 years into the future to come up with some horrendous sounding numbers for median housing prices in the big cities. I think if I was to throw in a cautionary note, I think although interest rates are falling, so fixed mortgage rates are on the way down already, and we'll probably see some monetary easing over the next year. I should just say, I think if you're looking to borrow today, you shouldn't assume there's going to be a lot of interest rate easing over the next 12, 18 months. There could be, but if the tariff turmoil sort of becomes a bit more becalmed internationally, and if the economy keeps holding together better than expected, as you mentioned, Labour government, quite a lot of immigration and big spending. So yeah, I just wouldn't assume that we're going back to super low interest rates. Chris, there's one other question I had for you, and that's with the change to student debts policy. So I think when assessing mortgage serviceability, previously that sort of help debt or student debts were sort of accounted for as part of your borrowing capacity. But looks like the Albanese government is basically instructing lenders to sort of disregard the student debts when assessing borrowing capacity. So I guess there's some sort of rough numbers that if you've got, let's say, a pre-tax income of 100K, well, that could flip an extra 50,000 onto your borrowing capacity, and you can flex those numbers up and down. But do you see that as a significant change for graduates or people with student debts?
So this is a bit of a moving ball at the moment, and banks are all sort of CBA came out, maybe a good month or so ago, and other banks have been coming out with their view on HECS debt. And if the banks can lend without including HECS debt, they absolutely want to. Any encouragement for the banks to be able to lend money, they're absolutely risk on right now. Banks want to asking less questions around applications. They just want to lend the money, etc. So I absolutely see this as a one tweak they can make to borrowing capacity that really helps into the market and gives them an advantage. The point I did make before, which I probably should have, is there's also an investor boom that's going to correlate to any sentiment of prices going up. Yes, there's investors who have been in the last few years. Yes, there's investors that have bought, in the 20 boom and can't buy anymore because they're capped out. But there's also a lot of people that, have a pretty low debt. They bought their house in 2015. They didn't participate in the COVID boom. They were very concerned about they're not going to upgrade because the jump's too big. They've decided to do a renovation. They're going to stay there, and they've got heaps of equity. And incomes have gone up a lot up over the last 7 to 10 years, and they're now going, well, I can't put more money into my super funds. I really should do something for my retirement, and I should buy an investment property. And they're also thinking, the amount of corporate conversations I've had in the last week around this is, can I capture the current that's around incentives for first home buyers in 5 or Brisbane and Melbourne circa 1 million. And so I think you'll also see, as first home buyers are entering, you'll also see a good correlation with investors trying to compete and take advantage of that arbitrage there. But yeah, anything that helps first home buyers, I think we're going to see longer loans, which we spoke about in the last couple of weeks, to improve borrowing capacity, because there is a conversation that's building where the haves and have-nots. If you're on a high income, you can buy. You're the ones who are dominating market. If you're not on a medium or low income, you're forced out of the market because borrowing capacity has been hit so much. So they need to try to find ways to increase their capacity.
Yeah, so that lending assessment buffer that's in place is a big part of that. I think you can see that most of the people active in the market are either dual income households or higher income earning households, and it's really shut out people at the lower end. And that's why the average loan size is up so much over the past year. And it's been driven by non-first home buyers when you break it down or disaggregate the numbers. Let's look at the second news article of the week. Rent vesting doesn't work, and here's why. Good sort of clickbait title in the Australian. So that's an article written by our good friend Stuart Weems, a Pro Solution private client. So if you're not familiar, the idea behind rent vesting is renting where you live, potentially in an area that's sort of maybe upmarket and expensive and close to work and all the amenities, but then investing all of your borrowing capacity elsewhere in sort of high capital growth locations, which is a strategy which has some pros and cons, and Stuart steps through them. It does some financial modeling around them. I suppose the big advantage, and look, I've somebody who's got some experience here because I've done a bit of both. My wife Heather and I have both variously owned our own homes along the journey, and then later on we sort of moved in together and rented and invested. So I've done a little bit of both. I think the main advantage of buying your own home, or a big one, apart from the autonomy that it gives you, is that there's a capital gains tax exemption. So if I think back to our parents' generation, what was quite common was for people to buy a first home, pay down a bit of the mortgage, and then when they got a pay increase or pay rise down the track, you trade up to the next one with no capital gains tax, and then you trade up to the next one, which I guess is probably something you've done yourself, Chris, over the years. I guess the question as to which is better. Well, I mean, Stuart says from a purely financial point of view, one of the challenges with rent vesting is that you don't get the capital gains tax discount. So at some point, presumably, you're going to sell those rental properties and pay CGT. I think sometimes you can end up with a lot of maintenance issues if you start owning 5, 10, 15 properties. It looks good on paper when you're younger, but, I've certainly discovered in recent years, there's always stuff going on, leaks and maintenance issues, and that can have a cash flow impact in its own right. And I think, I guess people have this idea of passive income from property, but it often just doesn't eventuate in the residential space. So I think there's pros and cons. I think in my experience, it worked for me quite well when I was younger because we moved around a lot. We lived in Asia, lived in Australia, weren't really sure where we were going to settle down. So I think it kind of made sense and the flexibility was good. I think the thing that really changed things for us was having kids. I think, once we had kids and then you start thinking about high school, we did end up buying a house unlevered, so no debt on it, and it needs everything doing and renovating. So it might not be the best financial decision, but it's a life decision. You want to be close to school, good school zone, house you can make your own. There's all of those sort of intangible benefits of owning a home as well, quite apart from the CGT benefit. So, yeah, Chris, you come across portfolio investors and people buying their first homes all the time. What do you normally sort of talk about? What variables and what kind of advice do you normally give?
Look, I think good advice is, not just one dimensional, right? And I think it's always shifting in time. I think what works in, say, 2025 may not work in 2027. There might be a better strategy. And I would say that rent vesting made a lot of sense when I first started back in mortgages and property, sort of 2012, 13, 14, 15. You could get way bigger lending if you were trying to buy an investment portfolio versus an owner-occupied portfolio. Getting interest only was really easy. You could get 15-year interest only. And rates were higher. And so hadn't had these huge rate cuts. And so owning homes was expensive. Owning investment properties was cheaper because it was all taxed. And you could basically, the loss on a big investment portfolio could have been cheaper than actually owning a much smaller market exposure in a home. And so you have to look at, that was a great time to be a rent investor. But if you flip it, the COVID boom, when interest rates collapsed and bank policy had tightened up dramatically since then. And so, you could borrow about the same amount when you're buying investment properties versus home. You look at the things that owner-occupied, that was an owner-occupied driven boom. And the things that went up the most were the houses in capital cities, often not what a lot of rent investors bought. I'd say in the recent years, you'd probably find the rent investors have done quite well because there's been a real push for the lower end of the market to go up because there's been an investor boom and affordability and rates have been higher. And so I'd say that it's been a good time for rent investors, but is it going to be good over the next few years? I think so. I do think it's one of those things that sometimes it works really well, sometimes it doesn't. But the big advantage is back into where you could buy much bigger portfolios with rent vesting versus owner occupier just isn't the case anymore. I think it's really tough no matter which direction you're going. Stuart's right. I think capital gains tax, first thing, lifestyle, which you mentioned around kids. The cost often when people buy rent vesting is when they want to buy a home, just because of the cost of doing so in capital cities nowadays is so large that their only option is, they want to keep those as investment properties. Their only option is to sell them. So they're paid stamp duty, they're paying selling costs, they're paying capital gains tax. By delaying the home ownership, there's probably an opportunity cost because they bought in later. They may not be able to do it. It's really hard to shift from multiple properties into a home. Like, it's actually quite stressful. It's not like shares. You just go on the market and sell. With properties, you've got to get them ready for sale. You've got to, get the agent in there. It takes months. Sometimes the properties can't sell because you sell them in a bad market, etc. So, there's lots of challenges with this model. I do feel like a lot of people go down this and bang, all of a sudden they've got 4, 5, 6 properties or even 2 or 3, and they go, has that really worked for me? Probably not. When they looked at the after-tax benefit versus maybe just buying a house to live in. And having a much simpler life, and maybe they got even a better result by just having a simpler strategy.
Yes, and those are some of the things that we had to grapple with ourselves. We did end up selling a couple of properties and they were tenanted, so we had to work through that. There was some capital gains tax to pay, although we got the discount. And of course, the selling agent wants some of the a clip of the ticket, and then you got to pay a lawyer. So I think, you can have this idea when you're younger that you're going to buy and never sell. But then, of course, life changes. You have kids, different stages of life. At some point, you want to realize those capital gains. And we were pretty lucky. We had some good tailwinds in Brisbane over the past 5 years that made it an easier decision to sell, I suppose. But I think, as you say, there's no one size fits all. And what might be suitable at one stage of the journey does change as you get a bit older. So let's look at this third and final news story of the week from Robert Harley in the AFR. Poll bumps off build to rent critics. So obviously, as you mentioned, Chris, a massive landslide majority for the Labour Party. And we know they're pretty keen on the build to rent sector in Australia. So that's where institutional capital comes into the housing market. It does have some advantages because you don't need apartment pre-sales. If the entire development is funded, they can be built more quickly potentially. And it's good for tenants potentially as well, because if they've got a corporate landlord, they can rent for maybe 12 months or 2 years or 5 years. There's no risk of losing that security of tenure. And I think from a housing market perspective, any additional supply is useful. I think some of the downsides to date anyway in Australia, generally build to rent units have been expensive. They tend to rent for 20 or 25% more than other properties. The median property on the market generally, it's usually apartments, generally speaking, in Australia. And I think, so far it's such a small part of the market that it hasn't moved the needle. But with Labour's tax changes to withholding tax for non-resident investors, maybe we could see 80,000 build-to-rent units over the next decade. So look, it's not huge potentially, but it sort of does help from a rental supply point of view. And as you said, this with the Senate sort of helping to pass legislation. So I think it was for managed investment trusts that were based offshore. The withholding tax has gone from 30% down to 15%, and that legislation is passed. So we might see some foreign capital institutional investors getting into the build-to-rent sector, building some of those big tower blocks, and that can just supply some of the rental market in Australia. I think it's very common in the US and increasingly so in London in recent years, but it's quite a new concept for Australia, and especially in Melbourne, I think we'll start to see more and more of this.
Yeah, it's interesting. Build to rent, I think it's a great part of our market. But let's say best case, as Labour Party thought we'd build 1.2 million homes over the next 5 years. What are we going to build? 800. So, even if they think they're going to build 80,000, do they build 50,000? Even if they build 80 or 100,000, and in that next 10 years that they build that build to rent, we'll probably build another 2 million properties as well, apartments and houses, and so they're probably 13 million. And so you're still well under 1% of the market, and absolutely. It'll be a good option for some people, and build to rent will gentrify more and more, and it's great for developers, and it's great for another investment option. But the amount compared to the overall property supply is very limited, and I think it gets a lot of airtime, this story, the build to rent. But the reality is, it's just like a tiny little needle in the whole haystack.
I think this story is more of a placeholder or a watch this space for the next decade. And at the moment, the numbers aren't huge. Projected that 10 billion per annum could be invested in this space by 2030. And certainly we've seen in London about maybe a quarter of the new housing stock in London comes via build to rent. So it will be important. It's just a question of how much scale Australia can generate over the years ahead. Chris, let's wrap up with a few listener questions. So we've got 3 here. So firstly, from Planning Ahead, I'm in New South Wales. Can I approach buyers agents directly to see if they have any clients interested in buying my property rather than engaging a real estate agent? I'm keen to avoid agent fees and marketing costs. Well, yes, you definitely can. I would say you're probably going to limit the potential pool of properties or people who can buy your property. So I think, a good real estate agent that's doing their job will use their database. They'll use the portals to get your property presented as well as it can be and get it out to the maximum number of people. And just a cautionary note, I've even seen 2 apartments side by side in New Farm. It was in Brisbane, exactly identical apartments. One was sold via an agent, the other one was sold privately by the person themselves to avoid the fees. And I think the difference in price was something like $60,000 or $70,000, and there was nothing to pick between the units. Just one was staged digitally and well presented and emailed to the database, and the other one was sold just by uploading a few pictures onto realestate.com. So I guess you certainly can do that, but maybe just a bit of a cautionary note as well that the professionals do know what they're doing.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the point here, Pete. Yeah, you can pay 2% to an agent, but do they get you 2% more in terms of your sale price to offset that? I do think the best agents who have got the best networks in the area, they know how to style a property, they know how to create urgency, they know how to create competition, and they know how to, get properties sold, good and bad. Particularly the bad ones, the ones that are harder to sell. Independent person in the middle can create that bit of smoke and mirrors to make you believe that there's competition, and that's actually what makes you actually make an offer, and means you make an offer that's actually a fair offer. So yeah, be really careful trying to sell your own home. I mean, there's lots and lots of scenarios where that just doesn't pay off, and the professional in the middle actually gets the job done rather than you just sitting around trying to make something happen.
Good advice. Second question from McCavity. Short and sweet question: shares or property in SMSF? So that's abbreviation for self-managed superannuation fund, if you're not familiar. So effectively your pension. Well, of course, this general advice disclaimer, of course, there's no one size fits all here. I'm somebody who's done both over the years. I've done an investment property. I've had investments in managed funds as well in my super. I think you can make the case for either. I mean, the general idea with super, when it was sort of first came around, is that you sort of potentially had your place of residence, and then your pension pot would be invested largely in managed funds or the stock market to get that nice sense of balance. You can do property in self-managed super. I'd say there are some potential pitfalls or disadvantages. You often can't use as much leverage. I think in recent years, there were some issues with high mortgage rates being charged in super and people getting trapped on high mortgage rates. I think I was actually one of that cohort during the Banking Royal Commission, and there's certain rules about what you can and can't do in terms of renovations and development. It's a bit stickier than doing things in your own name. Chris, do you get people come to you with similar questions? And has anyone sort of mentioned the changes to the $3 million cap for the tax rate and also for unrealized capital gains?
Look at your doomsday article today, right, which we're recording this on Thursday. Wealthy retirees are plowing money out of super because of the unrealized gains tax. I'm going to see over the next couple of weeks whether we start to hear more and more stories where the giving while living has actually happened more. The self-managed super fund question is a big one. I mean, I thought it was dead and buried a few years ago. I was quite publicly out there making posts around. I thought it was gone. I thought that the government would step in and stop people leveraging their superannuations into resi property. I was a bit naive, to be honest. I thought that common sense would sort of win here, and people would go, look, people are blowing up their super fund, buying off the plan, buying house and land packages, and they're already extremely over leveraged into property, their house, investment properties, and now they're putting all their super into resi. I guess the system probably taught me a lesson there. Don't out of it. And what it has done is, Parliament inquiries all recommended to get rid of self-managed super fund lending. And while the big banks pulled out, non-banks have come in. And there's been a lot more lending for self-managed super fund. A guy in our team, Pierre, she's absolutely all over it. And there's some non-banks that provide you a lot bigger borrowing capacity than even some other non-banks. And so we've seen a rise in that, particularly because a lot of people are capped out. They can't borrow any more money on their personal situation. They just love property. They look at their super fund. Super balances have gone up quite a lot over the last few years, particularly if you're a medium or a high income couple putting, 40, 50K a year into super. All of a sudden your balance is quite high and super's been performing quite well. And they're like, well, actually, I could actually go and get a pretty good asset here, particularly with these non-banks giving much bigger borrowing capacity. So been a big rise of it. Personally, I do like diversification. You've got enough in resi. Do you want to keep putting more money into property? But some of the recent changes have made that strategy maybe a bit better. in terms of you can get good assets but you've also got to be a bit concerned here that the rules on super are getting tighter, not looser every year. And so your ability to diversify out of resi once you've bought a resi property in your super fund might be quite hard. And so if that bet doesn't pay off, you might have blown your opportunity with super because you bought a poor asset.
Fair call. And thanks for that, Chris. And finally, it's more of a request than a question. Can you get a psychologist on the podcast to talk about how to navigate not being able to afford what you want? This is a sort of a hot topic. I've certainly observed over the years that as Australia has got wealthier, people are on average probably unhappier. If anything, they seem to be more uptight. I think Europe got crushed by the global financial crisis, and Australia, that kind of reset expectations for a lot of people, whereas Australia kind of just blazed ahead. And I think people start looking over their shoulders at what the next person has and the next person. And it's really hard. I don't think anybody's immune to this. One thing that I picked up, I'm not sure where from, probably a podcast or something, is the idea of having a gratitude journal, just to focus on being grateful for the things you do have, more so than looking at the things you don't have, because they often say envy or jealousy is probably the most useless emotion, because not only does it not help you, it also makes you feel bad. So look, it's not an easy market, and I suppose to a certain degree this impacts all of us, because we'd all like to afford bigger and better properties in locations that we can't stretch to. So maybe that's something we can look at doing in the podcast in the future. Chris, have you done anything similar on the Elephant podcast previously?
I think we have, actually. I think we've done quite a few episodes on this topic. And if you type psychologist into the Elephant, you'll probably find a few. But I do think this is a real just harsh reality of the market. It is what it is. And I think what sometimes gives you confidence is that you're not going this alone. Your challenges are absolutely what all your friends and your colleagues are going. Yes, you've got friends and who maybe are on higher incomes, and maybe they've got some intergenerational wealth that you haven't got access to, and a bit of a leg up. But it's hard to sort of, if you had parents who had that money, they'd probably give it to you too. So you wouldn't want them to think bad about you because they've got access to it. So I think it's just the harsh reality of, some haven't. But I do think everyone's making compromises every single stage, even the ones on, higher incomes, and maybe even also they've got a property, they've got a big mortgage, and that's making them make lifestyle compromises, etc. I just think this instability and insecurity people have, particularly, I think you just got to make sure like compromises, and things that, while it might feel like a compromise today, is actually still a good asset. Maybe it's not in 100% the area you want to live in. Maybe it's a little bit further out. Maybe it's not the 3-bed, maybe it's a 2-bed with a sunroom, and maybe it's not, a great walking distance to the trains, maybe a little bit too close to the train station that you want. And so I think you just got to figure out what are the right compromises you need to make to enter, and focus on the most important things, which is sometimes security and actually just getting an asset that's can provide that for you.
Sound advice, because yes, it's not always a level playing field, and yes, your peers or your friendship group, you might have people with big inheritances and people who don't. So it's very difficult to level that off sometimes. So Chris, let's wrap that up for the week here. So I'm going to probably head off to the monkey forest in a bit today and maybe check out a few waterfalls, but nothing too hectic. What's on for you this weekend?
This weekend, just some kids' birthday parties, to be honest. I'm playing football Sunday. Nothing too exciting here, Pete, but I'd much rather be going to monkey forest like you. But look forward to having a chat next week, and happy Sunday to everyone.
Sounds good. Cheers. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks for watching this video on the Rask Network. While you're here, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can get videos each and every day on business, finance, investing, and so much more.